Welcome to Gamecock Pod Live.
For the next 3 to 4 years, I'll be committed to the University of... This
is Rodgers again to the 25, 20, 15, 10. Rodgers scores!
Jackie Bradley Jr. delivered for the Gamecocks.
Lost it up, looking for Kelly. Touchdown! Can you believe it?
And South Carolina is sending shockwaves through the SEC.
Frederick plays it in at the buzzer. That's a win! Unbelievable! I don't believe it!
And now, live from Studio 54 of the Gamecock Pod Studios, here's the Cockfather himself, Keith Alsep.
All right, everybody, welcome into Gamecock Pod Live for Wednesday, July the 26th. And we have a special treat indeed. In just a few minutes, we will be joined by my good friend Ben Breiner, formerly of Go Gamecocks and the state, now breaking down all things Gamecock football in impressive fashion at thebigspur.com. Ben and I will take a deep dive into what the potential Dowell Loggains offense could look like. We'll talk about the playmakers, the scheme, the offensive line, maybe some of the newcomers that could impact this team, and in particular about how Spencer Rattler, I think, is set to have a monster season for the Gamecocks. Of course, as we all know by now, Gamecocks and Tar Heels under the lights, September the 2nd in Charlotte at Bank of America Stadium, Herb Street and Fowler on the call. College game day parked right there at Bank of America Stadium, highlighting that game on week 1 of the college football season. It'll be here before you know it. All right, before we get to Ben Breiner, one announcement. All patrons tonight join us on the Garnet and Black Town Hall. That has gone up on Patreon. I'm opening it up for all patrons tonight, not just VIP patrons. I've got a couple of special announcements, some things that will be coming, some new and exciting changes, and kind of a real town hall tonight where I'm going to talk about some issues that will impact everybody. And so be sure to tune in there. The link is up. It should be in your email notification, 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. It's a live Zoom call. It's like hanging out with up to 100 of your favorite Gamecocks and friends down at your local sports bar. It's a great time. By the way, you can go to our Patreon page at patreon.com/GamecockPod Daily. You can sign up and get a 7-day free membership, a 7-day free VIP membership, and you can join us on the Garnet and Black Town Hall tonight. Go ahead and get into our Nana's Porch news notes and headlines. Jump in at any point in the Nana's Porch chat box. I'll be happy to answer your questions. All right, let's get right to it. Gamecock football recruiting. Of course, we know this weekend on Friday actually is the end to the summer recruiting. South Carolina will have a big cookout, a star-studded cast from the class of 24 and 25 and 26. I'm not going to give you everybody's name, but maybe the two most important guys on the board for the Gamecocks, Dylan Stewart, the 5-star defensive end from the DMV from Washington, D.C. He will be there with his family. And Jalewis Solomon out of Slay County High School in Ellaville, Georgia, maybe the top defensive back on the board, been going back and forth, South Carolina and Florida State. His older brother plays at Auburn. He's scheduled to be at South Carolina on Friday and at Auburn on Saturday. He's going to announce on August the 5th, along with Burlington Cummings, 4-star wide receiver Jonathan Paylor. Paylor looks like it's going to be South Carolina or NC State. And so big things are happening. But on Sunday, a guy that I really like, Zamarian Lang. He's been on campus multiple times. He's worked out at wide receiver, at defensive back. He spent his high school career up into this point at Palmetto High School, which is kind of like Mullins High School in South Carolina. It's a AA school. It's not in a big city. 6'3", 170. He will announce between South Carolina, Pittsburgh, Kansas State, and South Florida. My good friend J.C. Sherbert has issued a crystal ball pick for the Gamecocks. I think this has been trending towards South Carolina for quite some time. He's a tall, rangy guy that's played high school quarterback. Very impressive wide receiver film, catches the ball naturally, got some twitch to him, runs past people. He's transferring this season to Sarasota Riverview, which is a 5A school in Florida, in a really big-time football conference down there. And so I'm excited to see what he does this season. Justin Stepp and Torian Gray absolutely love this guy. It's easy to tell why when you turn on the film. He is long, he's rangy, he's quick, and he's explosive. Great ball skills, displays great physicality. I think this will be a quality pickup for the Gamecocks at wide receiver, Zamarian Lang. He will announce on Sunday. All right. Also expected at the cookout, perhaps the top 2 defensive linemen in South Carolina's footprint, and maybe in the country, in Savannah, Georgia's Elijah Griffin, who just happens to go to the same school as current South Carolina commitment David Busey. They're teammates together. Griffin will visit South Carolina along with Amari Adams, who is the top defensive lineman in the state of South Carolina, one of those D-line heaven guys. He's moving from Lake City to South Florence, and so that'll be another step up in competition for him. They will be there tomorrow. 5-star defensive back Jonte Gilbert out of the Atlanta area, who's been committed to Ohio State, again, class of 25 guy. He will be at South Carolina. He's been a frequent visitor, and at one point it looked like it was almost a certainty for the Gamecocks to flip Gilbert, and I'm sure he'll spend the day with Torian Gray, Clayton White, and Shane Beamer on Thursday. Gamecocks, obviously, you got the proximity to home going for you, and why wouldn't you want to play for Torian Gray? Look what that guy has done. Also expected to be at the cookout, one more guy, 5-star offensive tackle, Solomon Thomas out of Jacksonville, Florida. He will be in attendance. And so you've got, that's 3 5-star trenchmen in Elijah Griffin, Amari Adams, and Solomon Thomas that are going to be on your campus, as well as a big-time defensive end from Greensboro that's in the class of 25. I think there will be more class of 24 guys that will show up. It is possible Daniel Hill and his family will come in. He is, of course, the top running back prospect on the board for the Gamecocks out of Meridian, Mississippi, 6'1", 225, state champion in the 110 high hurdles and the 300-meter intermediate hurdles. I mean, that should tell you all you need to know about a dude that's 225 pounds. I was like Stephen Davis, watching him at the state track meet when the 100 meters, he ran like 10.24, and Reggie Richardson, who was going to South Carolina, who had that long kickoff return against Clemson to start the second half in the 94 game. That was the trickeration when Brandon Bennett threw a lateral, or was technically a backwards pass, across the field, and Richardson raced down the sideline and really got tripped up by his own guy about the 5-yard line. I think Brandon Bennett took a tall sweep and ran in on the next play, and the route was on for the Gamecocks that day in Death Valley. I was there, and Reggie Richardson is fast, but he wasn't Stephen Davis fast. Stephen Davis ran off and left him. That was impressive. All right, a few women's basketball notes. Gamecocks non-conference schedule. As we all know by now, Gamecocks will open the season in Paris, France. Aflac has been brought on as the title sponsor, along with Under Armour, which South Carolina and Notre Dame are both Under Armour programs. They're the only 2 Under Armour programs to both be national champions. It's going to be a top 10 matchup November the 6th. It will be televised at 1 p.m. Eastern on ESPN. It will be the first time a women's college basketball game, regular season game, has been played in France. And so it's a really big deal. 2 high-profile programs, 2 high-profile coaches in Niall Ivey at Notre Dame, and, of course, South Carolina's Dawn Staley. Their non-conference schedule's coming together today. A game against East Carolina was announced. And so I'm just going to go through the games that we know about with some of the dates. So Gamecocks will face a challenging non-conference schedule, as always, opening in France with Notre Dame, who will be ranked in the top 10. They will face North Carolina on November 30th in Chapel Hill at the SEC ACC Challenge. So that will be a big game. UNC likely to be ranked in the...
Welcome.
Well, sorry about that. That's just me hitting my mouse. But we like the Rooster Crow, especially when we're playing the Tar Heels, opening with them in football and playing them in women's basketball in the SEC ACC a challenge. That will be on November 30th. December 10th, the Gamecocks will take on Utah, who won the Pac-12 last year. That will be in a multiple team event. MTE is what they call them now instead of tournaments, in Connecticut. Gamecocks will also have home games against national powers Stanford, Connecticut, and Maryland. They will also play Clemson, South Dakota State, and probably the last non-conference game will be that game announced today against East Carolina. That will be on December 30th. Gamecocks will play at UCLA, which they faced twice last year, once at Colonial Life Arena. They trailed going in the fourth quarter of that game, and then they also faced them in the NCAA tournament. Gamecocks will get a pause on that one this year, and they'll travel and play UCLA and Stanford on the same road trip, which quite frankly makes a lot of sense logistically. So maybe Joyce Edwards will be making her debut on that West Coast road trip for the Gamecocks. She is the top prospect in the country from Camden. She has not made her college decision yet, but South Carolina is going to be loaded because they're going to have another great recruiting class this year. One birdie already in the nest. That should be announced in August. Some rogue website tweeted it out. I looked at them. They had like 14 followers. Don't ruin a young person's announcement. Let them have their time to shine. Okay. All right. Switching to men's basketball. Elite Gamecock target top 20 prospect for the class of 24, Cam Scott, set to announce on August the 11th. South Carolina, Alabama, Texas, probably the top schools there for Cam Scott. But he is set to announce. He's also considering Auburn, Ole Miss, and Oregon, although since Chuck Martin left Oregon to go to Kentucky, I don't think the Ducks will be the choice. That will be on the On3 YouTube channel at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on August the 11th. Gamecocks also recently offered 6'7" wing player Trent Noah from Harlan, Kentucky, which I didn't even know that was a real place. Harlan, Kentucky, I know it from the FX series and the books by Elmore Leonard, Justified, with Raylan Givens and Boyd Crowder. Well, Justified is back this year. They wrote Raylan Givens and his daughter Willa into another Elmore Leonard book that's set in Detroit called City Primeval. Episode 3 was last night. Really good, but Raylan is the only character from the original Justified series, but it's a real city or town. Trent Noah from Harlan, Kentucky. He's had a great summer. Lamont Paris and staff watched every game. Dude has shot almost 44% from three this summer, averaging almost 13 points per game for his summer team. He is a knockdown three-point shooter. He will visit Seton Hall this weekend. And then in September, he will visit Western Kentucky on the 20th, South Carolina on the 22nd, and St. Louis on the 28th. Stanford also under consideration. All right, so that is your Nana's Porch news, notes, and headlines. Nana's Porch, an award-winning full-service catering company servicing the greater Charlotte area. They're awesome. Whatever you need, they've got you covered, whether it is a banquet, a wedding, a corporate event, a backyard bash. Labor Day weekend's coming up, football season's coming up. Maybe you want a big party, watch party at your house with the whole hog barbecue. Nana's Porch has got you covered. If you want to celebrate or bring in a food trailer, Nana's Porch voted among the top 3 by a local newspaper poll. And as we know, their pimento cheese voted numero uno in the meat and cheese category by the North Carolina Specialty Foods Association. Go to nanasporch.com. That's nanasporch.com. Get in touch with my good friend Chris Payne and support this Gamecock owned and operated business. All right, so Craig, I did mention Jalewis Solomon will be at the cookout on Friday. I think I said the only 224 guys that are scheduled to be there now, Dylan Stewart and Jalewis Solomon. I'm expecting more guys to show up. Dante Reno, however, I think is still in Mexico on vacation with his family, so he won't be there. Jalewis Solomon and Jonathan Paylor both set to announce on August the 5th. All right. I will be back with Ben Breiner right after this commercial message.
If you enjoy listening and watching the free Wednesday show, now live streaming on YouTube, and would love more Gamecock Pod daily, join our growing Gamecock family by becoming a monthly or annual subscriber. You'll be able to listen to the show every day of the week and listen to guests like J.C. Sherbert, Hale McGranahan, and John Whittle from thebigspur.com, Colin Taylor and Mike Uva from Gamecock Central, Emily Adams from the Greenville News, Ben Portnoy, Michael Lanana, and Jeremiah Holloway from GoGamecocks.com, Michael W. Bratton, the host of That SEC podcast, and many, many more. As a VIP subscriber, you can join or listen to the weekly live Zoom call with up to 100 of your favorite Gamecocks and friends. After the show is an unrecorded overtime segment where the real scoop gets dropped and discussed. It's like going down to your local pub or sports bar and having a conversation with your Gamecock friends about last week's football game, men's and women's basketball games, and Gamecock baseball. And of course, there's always recruiting to discuss. In addition to the weekly Zoom call, VIP subscribers get the most popular podcast, The Morning After, which is released every Sunday morning during football season, and more VIP perks are in the works. Follow Keith on Twitter at KAllset, or follow the show on Twitter at GamecockPod. Go to the top of the homepage and follow the link. If all else fails, go to patreon.com/GamecockPodDaily. Join now and get up to 3 months free off an annual VIP subscription. You will love it, guaranteed. Now, back to Gamecock Pod Live.
All right, and so we welcome in for the first time to Gamecock Pod Live, Ben Breiner, Prime Ben, formerly of Go Gamecocks and the State, now breaking down and doing a fine job of it, by the way, of South Carolina offense and defensive plays, schemes, etc., at thebigspur.com. Ben, thanks for being with us. How are you doing, my friend?
I am doing all right. It's summer. We don't have football. We have a lot of thinking about football to do. Got a nice vacation, and 2 weeks after, I still kind of wish I had a vacation for my vacation. So, getting by and looking at those tweets that remind me that, it's only, 5-6 weeks out?
So are they still tweets or are they X's?
I'm never going to stop calling them tweets. It's just easier.
It is easier, although yesterday the X was trending in more than one way on the platform formerly or currently known as Twitter.
Keith, I'm sorry that I'm going to say this on Gamecock Pod Live, but at some point he's going to steal someone else's joke and demand that they be called skeets, and we're just going to be in a world of trouble.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe AI has already taken control of the mind of Elon Musk, and Skynet is upon us.
Well, I don't think Skynet nuked Charlotte, so at least I'll be okay.
So, hey, on my vacation, I got to run into you on purpose at Sip City in Charlotte, along with my good friend Chris Payne, one of the sponsors of Gamecock Pod Live, Nana's Porch, the Nana's Porch chat box, and our news and notes segment. So what have you been up to since then? I know you went on vacation. I went and saw the Atlanta Braves play, and my God, I thought I was like my man's dad at the end of Field of Dreams. I wanted to ask if I was in heaven. It was just fabulous.
I got to escape to California for a little. I've managed to overbook every weekend up until football season. And I managed to finish my scouting report for the University of North Carolina and South Carolina's opener. And I'm officially tired of watching both the Tar Heels and anything to have to do with their new offensive coordinator. I would like that game to happen, please.
So ESPN College Game Day, they are coming to your city. You live in the Queen City now. They will be there broadcasting on Saturday morning. Kirk Herbstreit and Chris Fowler will be on the call for, I think, ABC that Saturday night. Great quarterback matchup, Drake May versus Spencer Rattler. A rematch of the Duke's Mayo Bowl. Maybe Mac Brown is out for some revenge and wants to eat some Duke's Mayo that night. I don't know, on a chicken sandwich. And so just your thoughts on, this was already a big game for South Carolina. I mean, you have 8 SEC games. You open with North Carolina. You close with Clemson. Those are the two teams that met in the ACC championship game last year. Just your thoughts on now that magnifying glass being even bigger on this matchup with College Game Day and Pat McAfee wearing a tank top, probably. I just don't understand the infatuation with him, but at any rate, it should be quite a spectacle at Bank of America Stadium.
Oh yeah, it's definitely going to be a scene. I'm kind of excited to see what downtown Charlotte looks like for that one. And I'll be interested to see, I think we've seen some weird moments of South Carolina showing up or South Carolina not showing up in the past few years. So this feels very much like a show-up game to me. You know, you look back last year, this is a team that went from losing to Missouri and Florida to beating Clemson and Tennessee. Now, you know, even if they had half the effort they had against Clemson and Tennessee, they would have beaten Missouri and maybe beaten Florida, at least not gotten blown out. I don't think this UNC team is all that good. They might prove me wrong, but I think they're plenty vulnerable. I think a lot of it just depends on, does a coherent, together Gamecocks team show up, or do we see, you know, the way the team opened, I would say in 2019 or even 2018, where, you know, that 18 opener, they played Coastal Carolina at home, but they weren't crisp. They weren't really on point. They won by 1 million because Coastal was just not very good at that point. But, you know, if this team shows up crisp, shows up knowing its stuff, I think you got a good spot. If they show up, you know, the way they showed up against Missouri last year, we could be in for a very weird evening on a very big stage.
It will be a very big stage. You know, I think it ups the ante anytime you open with a quality opponent. North Carolina, the perception is they are a quality opponent. I kind of feel like you. My good friend Brad Lawing had a very good source at Chapel Hill who, quite frankly, felt like they're softer than the Pillsbury Doughboy up there. And, you know, Drake May's not going to have Joshua Downs as that security blanket and that guy that was, you know, caught 1 million passes the last couple of seasons. He's gone. And so, I mean, what are your thoughts about the guys around Drake May?
I will be interested to see, the first thing I'll be interested to see is what kind of running back development they've had. Because if memory serves, I don't think they added anyone super of note. So that's going to be kind of a big question for me. They got everyone back, but they were also just not a very good running team last year. And it was interesting to kind of go through the film because Drake May obviously had pretty good numbers, and he's a decent runner. But I kind of expected him to be a little more dynamic and a little better, and he's solid. He'll convert some third downs, but he's not necessarily. He ain't scaring you. I mean, he was, I would argue, less scary than the Missouri quarterback, whose name is totally escaping me. But you know,
Brady Cook, I think, last year.
He did not strike me as much scarier of a runner than Brady Cook, which I think says a little bit because, you know, Brady Cook's a nice QB, but he's not freaking you out at all. The thing that I'll be interested in is who they added in the transfer portal, because they got a couple of guys, one's from Kent State, and I cannot for the life of me remember where the other guy's from, who probably step in as starting receivers. So you're probably talking about J.J. Jones and those two guys. This team just lost a lot of receiving talent around Drake May, so you're kind of counting on May to step in there. And the main thing that I'm sort of interested in is what happens with life after Phil Longo. Because Phil Longo's scheme is really smart, and it makes life a ton easier. And doing kind of a close viewing of the film, that team last year had a lot of missed chances, a lot of spots where they weren't really on point, but the overall offensive scheme sort of carried them and made things better. And, you know, if you're switching from that to maybe an offense that isn't, you know, really at that top level in terms of scheme, all of a sudden those flaws and those issues, those missed passes get magnified.
I agree. All right, so let's pause talking on that game because I really want to get into a deep dive on your thoughts on this South Carolina football team. And so I'm just going to cross you up right off the bat and ask you, how many wins per year do you think Pete Lembo is worth as special teams coordinator?
That's an interesting question, just because I don't know. I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that special teams are going to be as big an element as offense or defense. But I would say between a half and one. And considering, his groups aren't generally going to lose you games. They're, for the most part, only going to be plus, and they're going to be solid. I mean, that's important. You're not losing games. You're not giving away free yardage. And you're going to have pop plays every so often. And that's just real helpful to have. Plus, it's a second set of hands to be able to do different stuff. I remember, I think I can talk about this now. I had talked to Pete years ago. I think he was maybe still at Memphis. And I was just chit-chatting about whatever and asked him about practice at Memphis. And he basically said, because Mike Norvell was calling plays, I could sort of step in and do a little bit of everything kind of during practice because I'd been a head coach. I knew how to do some of that stuff. I had that experience, so I could guide or correct here or there. And I just think kind of having that and having a coach there who works with everyone, I think that's just a tremendous value.
I mean, Ben, when I look at it this past season, I look at the first game of the season and then the last regular season game of the season, and special teams, I think, really won that Georgia State game because South Carolina's offense was doing nothing until they started blocking punts and running them into the end zone for touchdowns. And then clearly the Clemson game, just the sheer factor of Kai Kroger flipping the field and pinning Clemson inside the 10 and inside the 5-yard line, I believe 6 different times. And I think they showed the Pete Lembo smile 2 or 3 times in the fourth quarter. And then obviously the final punt with Nate Atkins knocking it out and Nick Emanwari jumping on it. I mean, those were, I thought, pivotal for South Carolina to not give Clemson even decent field position and force them to have to run the ball because DJU couldn't hit the broad side of Frank Howard Memorial Stadium, let alone a wide receiver. I just thought it was huge, not to mention the fact that because South Carolina special teams were so good that Dabo Sweeney said, oh, well, you think your special teams are good? Watch this. And they do the little group huddle, and 5'10", 170-pound Mitch Jeter slings a 235-pound running back around, and he fumbles the football, and the Gamecocks fall on it. That was just a huge momentum swing in that game, as was Amarian Brown's 37-yard punt return to set up the first touchdown in the second half for South Carolina.
Oh, yeah, that group just evolved kind of into being that group that kind of – I think as you're kind of going back to that Clemson game, my brain sort of went to – it wasn't just a factor of those big plays it made. It was the fact that, you didn't have moments like where you try to trick play and the ball pops out. You had fewer of those. You're not losing on muffed punts. You're not kicking it out of bounds necessarily. You're avoiding some of those. And then, that translates into it's funny when you go over film and you kind of try to watch everything situationally, and you're sort of reminded that everything sets up everything else, right? why are you in 3rd and 9? Because because someone reached up and tipped a ball on 1st and 10 when you threw it on an RPO. All these things matter. And, like you said with Kai Kroger, if a DJU run offense is having to climb out from its own 12-yard line over and over, well, that's not going to be very good now, is it?
Not at all. Not to mention the fact that Mitch Jeter, he had the pressure kick. I mean, it wasn't a really long kick, but it gave South Carolina the lead, and the moment was not too big, and he basically split the uprights. On that field goal. You had a great snap, hold, which was adventurous at times during the season for South Carolina. But, I mean, that was just another perfectly executed play, and I think people forget about Mitch Jeter. I mean, all he did was kicked off into the end zone about every time for touchbacks, and when they decided to kick it up high, teams rarely ran it past the 25-yard line, and the guy didn't miss a single field goal.
Not a bad little year for the man. Not a bad one.
Not at all. All right, so I wanted to start off with Pete Limbo because I know that's your guy. And he got a big raise and well-deserved. And I think Shane Beamer is very fortunate to have Pete Limbo on his staff. All right, so let's switch to offense. Spencer Rattler. I think a lot of this was because of the scheme, because of the complexity, because really you had a guy that was trying to run an NFL system in Captain Dumbass, as we refer to him on the pod, that just really was more concerned about trying to prepare the team to run 112 plays and have 18 to 20 personnel groupings than he was on getting the ball to his playmakers in space and letting them make him look good. And so he's out now, and in comes Dowell Loggains, who spent 17 years in the National Football League, 15 of those years either coaching quarterbacks or calling NFL offenses. He spent a spring at Penn State with James Franklin and I believe Mike Yurcich. And then he spent the last 2 years with Kendall Briles and Sam Pittman at Arkansas. And Ben, from his opening press conference, he is clearly a guy that understands the difference in the National Football League and college football. And so what are you kind of expecting from a Dowell Loggains offense?
I am probably expecting some quick, a fair amount of RPOs, maybe less of the sort of slower developing drop back stuff that they tended to kind of run there. They still used a modest amount of air raid stuff, but I'm going to be interested to see first what kind of stuff they can sort of get out of the run game, especially it's a little different because he's obviously coming from a place where you had KJ Jefferson, and Spencer Rattler is not KJ Jefferson. But Rocket Sanders as well. Rocket Sanders. So I'll be interested to see what he can kind of do with the run game. And I'll be interested to see how much of that receivers reading the coverage kind of stuff they do. Because really, like, what Arkansas ran was not worlds different in terms of the belief in scheme than what Tennessee runs. It's just a matter of Tennessee has a certain set of talented athletes and Arkansas had a different one. And I mean, I'd heard from some places Tennessee probably wanted to run more stuff that Arkansas kind of did. It's just they had the dudes they had. So I'll be interested to see where it kind of falls on that continuum. I'll also be interested to see one thing that I kind of noticed that I found very weird last year was the fact that South Carolina, it seemed like certain weeks there would be stuff that an opponent tended to run, and that would become a little more prominent in the game plan. For example, they had a certain way they ran counter that was kind of a favorite of the way Kentucky ran it, and that seemed to pop a little bit more after the Kentucky game. Granted, it was also really one of their best run plays, so that worked well. Or when they played Tennessee, they did a lot of switch releases, which was a Vol staple. So I'll be interested to see if that kind of continues, if that's maybe more of a head coach tick, or if that kind of dissipates as you change offensive coordinators. Also, it'll be interesting to see, how much tempo they can run.
So I would expect more tempo. The biggest rule change will affect offenses and defenses because the clock will not stop on first downs unless the ball is out of bounds until the final 2 minutes of each half. And I mean, that's really when everybody pays attention to it. You don't pay attention to it the first 28 minutes of the first half. Maybe you do, depending on time and score situations inside the last 5 minutes or even the last quarter of the game. But that's a big deal because it is going to mean 8 to 10 less plays per game. Based on what some of the players talked about and based off what I've heard about the things that Dowell Loggains has embraced from that Briles modified air raid scheme, I think they will run a good bit of tempo. But to me, it's the curious case of Spencer Rattler because I thought he looked like a guy that, after the Arkansas game, was essentially confined to being a guy that threw the ball east and west until they played Tennessee. You went from game 2 until game 11, and most of the throws he was making outside of South Carolina State or Charlotte when they took shots was horizontal and not vertical. How do you expect, or what do you expect the Dowell Loggains influence or impact to be on Spencer Rattler?
I will be interested to see what level of kind of quick game they can sort of work in there. On the one hand, I'd have to look back. I don't feel like the bear raid stuff tends to be that much quick game. I think a lot of that is horizontal or deep shots. But a lot of that also does tend to flow into slants, especially kind of what, you saw some of the stuff Tennessee did. So I'll definitely be interested to look into that. I know last year, South Carolina literally led the country in percentage of passes that were caught at or behind the line of scrimmage at roughly about 40%. I think some of that was scheme. I also think some of that was offensive tackle play was, about as inconsistent as it's usually been. So there was a lot of Marshawn Lloyd is right there, and a defensive lineman is about to land on top of Spencer Rattler, so the ball just went where it went. But I could definitely see a little bit more of that intermediate game in terms of just, diversifying it a little bit, because obviously it wasn't like that passing offense did exactly what you want. And looking at some of the Arkansas numbers, they were still a little more throwing short than throwing long, but at least they were, 36th in terms of passes at or behind the line of scrimmage, not first by a mile.
So one of the things that befuddled me is Spencer Rattler at Oklahoma statistically was at his best when they moved the pocket on design bootlegs, waggles, rollouts, And I really think you could probably count on one hand about the times they did it, and probably the one time they did it that South Carolina fans will remember was in the second half against Clemson when they rolled Rattler out of the pocket and he hit Juice Wells right on stride for a 71-yard touchdown. And I'm like, wow. He finally figured out that that's what the guy does best, and he did it one time. I had that SEC StatCat guy on. That really befuddled him because he rattled off all the statistics, all the numbers from short to medium to deep passes. Spencer Rattler was elite in every single category when they moved the pocket at Oklahoma. Yet, you know, the former guy does very little of that. Would you anticipate? I would anticipate Dowell Loggains trying to maximize the talents of all of his playmakers. And in particular, Spencer Rattler, that's why he came back. And so do you think we'll see the guy we saw at the end of the year that played free, or is it going to be more of the same from the first 10 games of last season?
Oh, Keith, if I could answer that question, I'd be both in Vegas and probably in the building coaching, explaining how to fix that problem. But it does bear mention the fact that, and for reasons that have to do with my broken brain, I watched the entirety of the second half against Tennessee a couple days ago because I couldn't sleep. And it was interesting to rewatch that version of Spencer Rattler, who, when he was moving, when he's on and he's moving in the pocket and he's escaping pressure, he can put the ball in some great spots. And when he's off, you know, we all remember the missed open touchdown against Arkansas. There might have been a second one against Arkansas. There were a few plays where he'd be on the run and he'd miss, and you'd kind of say, well, it's hard to throw on the run. But also part of what makes Spencer Rattler is that he can make those hard plays. I don't know if we'll see it all the time. I think part of Dowell Loggains' big assignment is to make sure there are less of those moments. Like, not necessarily the moving the pocket part, but the running around, potentially running for his life moments. And moving the pocket's a great way to do that because, you know, you don't have to block a backside end. As much. You make the reads easier, and you get a little help on that front side. So I'll be interested to see how much you can do that, and does that clean things up a little bit, especially in terms of making that picture clearer, because, you know, you only have three options.
No doubt. So my good friend Jamie Bradford today on the Inside the Gamecocks, or actually it was yesterday on Inside the Gamecocks, the show, talked about the veteran playmakers surrounding Spencer Rattler. I've not had a chance to deep dive and double check his numbers, so he's probably right on all of this. But if you take the number of years played with Mario Anderson, DeCarrion Joyner, Juju McDowell, Trey Knox, Joshua Simon, Juice Wells, Xavier Legette, Eddie Lewis, and Amarian Brown, that's 35 years of college football playing experience. It's over 10,000 yards of total offense. It's 123 touchdowns. It's 195 SEC games played, 73 SEC starts. And well, I can't even read my own writing on the last one, so we'll just
I'm not going to
leave it at that.
It's a lot.
It is. I mean, it is a lot. That's a lot of veteran guys. I mean, for instance, like the Texas A&M game. Obviously, Xavier Legette ignited and blew the roof off Williams-Brice Stadium with the kickoff return for touchdown. But there was a play, maybe it was right before the half. Spencer Rattler was on the run, and he threw an absolute laser that basically knocked Xavier Legette down in the end zone, and the ball went through his hands. He threw it so hard, but Rattler was running for his life, and I mean, he put it like a laser on target. I mean, man, that guy can make plays. And, you know, Juice Wells, arguably the best returning wide receiver in the SEC, at least statistically, he is the leading returning statistical wide receiver in the conference. He was voted second team by the media. I'll be interested to see what the coaches say. But you've got a wealth of other guys in addition to him that have played a lot of football, and quite frankly, some guys that have just been underutilized, like Amarian Brown, who broke Calvin Johnson, a.k.a. Megatron's freshman record for touchdown catches at Georgia Tech. And in 2 years, Captain Dumbass couldn't draw up a single ball play to get that guy a touchdown. Amarian Brown has 0 touchdown receptions at South Carolina. That is a mind-boggling statistic for the fastest guy on your roster.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see, in terms of, I guess the phrase I would use is consistent playmaking, what we kind of see. Because, you know, I think Juice Wells is going to be a guy for every game, every season. It took them a little bit to get to that place last year. I think he's here. I think he's arrived. My next question is kind of, who's the next most consistent? Is it Amarian Brown? Do they find the right ways to use him? Do they let him be a little bit of a bell cow? You know, they used him a little as a gadget guy late last year. Where does that go? I think those are probably, you know, sort of your top 2 wide receiver options. Then the next question is going to be, what can Xavier Legette become as a playmaker? What does Eddie Lewis look like in this new offense working against SEC defensive backs? You know, if he's as good as his stats and whatnot say he might be, you know, that's a third playmaker right there. And then you bump over and you just have the Trey Knox question, which is, I think Trey Knox can be really good, pops off on film to me. I've talked to a couple of different people that are maybe a little less high on him than I am, but I think that in itself is going to be one of the big Dowell Loggains questions, because the fact was Jaheim Bell is gone, and Jaheim Bell was a guy that the old offensive staff and scheme couldn't unlock. They just, you know, they could not make him a consistent playmaker. They couldn't figure out, you know, do you stick him at wide receiver if you're worried about his blocking? They never quite could land on that. And, you know, I ended up in a discussion with someone about it and sort of pointed out that, because someone was saying it was a real problem and he left. And I sort of looked at it and I said, he didn't have the season he wanted to last year. And whether that's scheme or some on him or whatnot, the use just never worked. And so I think that Trey Knox can be very, very good. I'm just very interested to see how Dowell Loggains uses him, what positions he gets put in, how can you use him to attack not only short, not only deep, but in those intermediate spaces.
I mean, I totally agree on Knox. You know, he was recruited Justin Stepp signed him as a wide receivers coach at Arkansas. Dowell Loggains, he was a big wide receiver. He gained weight. They moved him to tight end. Dowell Loggains coached him the last 2 years. If anybody knows what Trey Knox is capable of, it is Dowell Loggains. But I also think Joshua Simon, coming from Western Kentucky, is a guy that's also very intriguing, 6'4", 240 pounds, a guy that can really be just like Knox, a wide receiver, very productive at Western Kentucky. And I was told, had South Carolina not signed this guy named Harbor, who we've yet to talk about, that Joshua Simon would have been in the wide receiver room in spring practice. And so to me, both of those guys at tight end or flex tight end, or, you could really go tempo and change your look from 2 tight ends to 14 personnel in a hurry, or 13 personnel, go 5 wide without substituting at all, I think could be very advantageous. But to me, to your earlier point, Juice Wells is a guy. To me, and I mentioned this when I talked about the super seniors, and in particular DeCarrion Joyner and Xavier Legette, who have faced adversity and who have persevered and who have seen some success. I think a guy like Xavier Legette, that's 6'3", 220, who flourished in the Gator Bowl, who had 2 touchdown receptions, won a Sports Center top 10 nominee. I think it's really critical for him to take that next step, so that there is a guy that you have to plan for on the opposite side of the field of Juice Wells, that is big, is strong, is athletic, and can hurt you in the short, intermediate, or the deep passing game.
I would definitely agree on the Xavier Legette front. If he arrives and he is a productive receiver, I don't necessarily mean like an 800-yard guy, even if he's just a 400-yard guy, that opens some things up for you. Now, on the flip side, I'm also just going to be interested to see, does anyone pop from the freshman class? And maybe not necessarily pop in terms of, again, 400, 500 yards, but do they pop in terms of going out there, making their share of plays, throwing some blocks? And this also might be, some of the semi-veteran guys, your Omega Blaker, your Landon Sampson. They're guys that have been around for a minute. They haven't done much to this point. Is that indicative of, their overall potential, or is that indicative just of them not developing to this point? So, those are names that I always keep a little bit of an eye on to see, is that person going to take a step? And then you just got that Nicholas Harbor question, which, what can you do with him? What is he able to do? Is he a good perimeter blocker? Is he, does he take a year to develop that college toughness? These are all these sort of questions, because it's such a interesting position shift where he was going to be, he's very athletic, but he was always going to be a bit of a project just because you didn't quite know where to play him. Obviously, he's trying to maintain a certain build. But, if he's a guy who comes in and, looks ready to, no one except for, Wisconsin crack blocks anymore. But if he looks like a guy who wants to, legally crack block someone, well, that opens up a world, just because you can throw him out there and at worst say, hey, look, one of my receivers can just fall on top of your corner, and that's going to be that.
He can also pretty much run by about anybody that lines up opposite of him. And so I'm really interested about him. On yesterday's show, I talked about 5 true freshmen not named Nicholas Harbor that I expect to make impacts. And the one guy at the wide receiver position who I've heard nothing but rave reviews since the day he got down there is Elijah Caldwell. 6'1", 190, plays in a, really big time program at Northwestern High School, a guy that is a refined, polished route runner, physical, run after the catch. And when Dowell Loggains got to South Carolina and he watched the film and went and evaluated him, he said, hey, this is the guy I want on my football team. He is a playmaker. And so for me, that's the guy that I'm looking at along with Nicholas Harbor at that wide receiver position to supplement with those veteran guys that we talked about.
Yeah, I think it seems like every offseason there's one receiver that kind of gets that attention. And a lot of years that receiver, it turns out, is a guy who does make an impact or does play. And so I'll be very interested to see, because I think to a degree we almost understate. On the one hand, Will Muschamp gone now, but did love to say, this is a downside. I covered him so much. All of my cliches just fall back to him, even though it's a totally normal cliche that, the closer you play to the ball, the harder it is to play as a freshman. But I think that kind of understates, a lot of the time you will see teams and the freshman receivers will not play, and it doesn't totally make sense why. So I feel like there's an extra level of standard that we don't totally think about. But if he's a guy who arrives and can do those little things, can learn those plays, can be in the right place, can, refine his footwork and have all those pieces in place, that's the kind of thing that gets a guy on the field. And, you can't catch balls unless you're on the field. So he's another name very much that I'll be kind of, keeping an eye on, not just in terms of production, but just trying to track early snap counts and saying, is that a guy that gets 9 or 10 snaps against UNC? Is that a guy that gets 20 snaps before garbage time against 20 is a little high, but 10 to 15 snaps before garbage time against Furman? What kind of ability does that person show to get on the field, and then what kind of playmaking can follow?
I agree. All right, so at running back, this is probably, to me, the biggest question on the offense, because you are light on numbers. You are light on particularly Division I experience. Mario Anderson has the most yards, has played the most running back. He was a Division II Heisman finalist, even though it's not called the Heisman, but the equivalent of the Heisman Trophy. It's still a big adjustment going from Newberry and playing against Division II defenses to week 3 when you go to Athens and you're between the hedges against Georgia. But DeKerian Joyner, a guy that seemingly has done everything that's been asked of him, that's been a great teammate, that went from quarterback to wide receiver. Then in 2019, when Jake Bentley has the Liz Frank injury, they have to move him back to quarterback, even though he's nursing a bad hamstring. Ryan Helinski's got a torn meniscus and can't play the second half of the Georgia game. He has to roll out there and did nothing to lose that game and help South Carolina pull off one of the biggest upsets in program history that day. I mean, he hadn't been super productive at wide receiver. But when I look at the usage in the Tennessee game last year when they were finding ways to be creative running the football, with him running the football, I thought he was effective, and I thought he looked pretty good in the spring game. Now he's gone from 215 to 229 pounds. I mean, I think the odds are pretty high that on the first play from scrimmage for South Carolina's offense, you're going to have Spencer Rattler and DeCarrion Joyner lined up beside each other in the shotgun. What say you?
That does seem like probably the most logical outcome. This is the position battle I'm the most interested to watch across the course of August camp, because every one of these players, it's sort of interesting. I ended up doing sort of a study on the history of South Carolina running backs, where every year they would come in with like 4 guys that you would call Mondenson quality or better for the most part, sometimes 3. And then you ended up getting a lot of, 400, 500, 600, 700 yard seasons. Really more in the 600. I think there were 2 700-yard seasons in the entire era. And I will be interested to see, does someone pop and take command enough to be a 700-yard type guy? And if they don't, can you develop a solid feeling enough running game with a bunch of pretty good ball players? That's sort of my question. Because South Carolina's problem for a long time has been it hasn't necessarily had that one guy who just sort of takes the reins. And the one time it did, it was Kevin Harris, and basically the entire offense was melting around him. So, what does that really count for? So I'll be interested to see, and I think we're at a point where every one of these kids has a certain level of upside, and we've kind of chewed it over so much that people got excited about it earlier in the offseason, and then maybe during the spring game they got a little down about it. And now we're about to go through actual camp, the part that counts, and now there's sort of this kind of shrug. I guess we'll see what we're looking at. I mean, you've got a 4-star freshman. You've got a kid who ran for 1 billion D2 yards. You've got a pretty good athlete in DeCarrion Joyner who's now 230 pounds. You've got Juju McDowell, who I don't know if he's any heavier, but, he's had moments. And the question is, how does that come together? How does that develop? How do those guys become ball players on Saturday? Not just sort of the idea that we have of them. And does this staff figure out good roles for all of them, good ways to maximize their ability? So I'll be very interested, because it is just so open. Like, if anyone steps up and shows that ability, they could get 200 plus carries. And if no one does, then you're kind of relying on the touch and the feel of a coaching staff to move them around and have them in the right moments.
I mean, where maybe you have 3 guys that have 100 to 120 carries each.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends who gets in there, who produces, who has those moments, who's busting tackles, who's beating, because really, assuming your offensive line is doing your job, a good running back is beating 1 guy per play. And that 1 guy you beat is worth 3 to 4 yards, maybe a little bit more. And a great running back might beat 2 or 3 guys. I don't know that this team has a beat 2 or 3 guy on this group yet, but I think you got a lot of guys with the ability to at least beat the 1. And that's the foundation of a solid run game.
All right. And so the foundation of the run game starts up front with the offensive line. There's been a trading places, not the same as Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd, but Lonnie Teasley and Greg Adkins have officially switch titles, although for most of the season, Lonnie Teasley was the everyday line coach. Greg Adkins was the analyst due to health issues. They finally looked like they had it right at the end of the season, and then you go into the spring game, and Jalen Nichols goes down with a knee injury. I don't even know if it's feasible to count on him at all for this season. And so for me, I'm looking at probably Ja'Kai Moore at left tackle, Nick Gargiulo, the captain of Team 149 at Yale. Only one team captain there every year. Vershawn Lee, who's played a lot of football. He's played center, guard, and tackle, even as a true freshman. Trey Jones, a guy that was a camp guy that at 265 pounds the summer before his senior year ran 4.61 in camp, scored a touchdown at the end of the first half after one of the more befuddling fourth down play calls by an Auburn or any head coach. When you had the ball at your own 30-yard line, you should have just punted the damn ball. I think it's the 34-yard line, actually. He's 300 pounds now.
You got to live dangerously.
Brian Harsin, I mean, wow. And then Tyshawn Wanamaker, who's played a lot of football at South Carolina, he's probably the right tackle. I do think, there's one or two young guys that could figure on the interior there, Trevon Ball and possibly Marquis Anderson. But I'm very intrigued. Shane Beamer yesterday on the JC and Morgan podcast, which was streamed live on YouTube, was specifically asked about Nye Manziel, the South Carolina native and transfer from Mercer, and Jackson Hughes, who started 19 games at Charlotte, and I think 12 of those were at left tackle. And his quote was that they felt like they got two scholarship level talents who have already impacted their football team, and he feels like have positional versatility and the ability to challenge for a starting spot and be in the two deep. And so what are your thoughts and expectations for the offensive line in a Dowell Loggains offense versus a scheme that was evidently so complex and complicated that Greg Adkins, a guy who's coached forever and coached in the NFL, even grasped to be able to teach his players? I mean, it's kind of like calculus. And offensive linemen in the Southeastern Conference are generally not making A's in calculus unless they're at Georgia Tech. And then they're still probably just barely skating by.
I mean, listen, I was a shrimpy nerd in college, and I also did not make A's in calculus. So, calculus is hard. But you kind of touched on a point that I'm very interested in, which is, can this team get good, clean offensive tackle play for the first time in years and maybe years after that? This team at times has had one good offensive tackle. It's been pretty rare they've had two particularly good ones. I guess I want to say there was a year with Dennis Daly and Zach Bailey on the outside, maybe. That was solid. But overall, that position has been much more of a bugaboo than the interior. And as you kind of said, you've got three guys in Jones, Lee, and Nick from Yale. I'm not gonna butcher his last name here. And Tyshawn Wanamaker is a guy who, in theory, could bump inside if you had enough offensive tackle depth. I'd have to look back. I feel like, did Ja'Kai Moore play a little guard at some point, maybe? Anyway.
He did. He started the season at left tackle, and then they kind of switched him and moved him to left guard and played Nichols beside him at left tackle.
Yeah, so you've got a lot of guys who, in theory, could bump in if they're struggling on the outside and you have a better option. So I feel pretty confident about that middle of the line. You'd like to see him get a little more push than he did last year at times. Last year's team suffered from the, I guess I'm going to call it the inside zone problem, which is that if you have a good offensive line and it's 3rd and 1, usually you can run inside zone, and even if they have all 11 guys there, you can slam it up in there and get your damn yard. That's been an issue for this program for a minute. Would like to see a little more push there, but just the number of sort of names and options that they could potentially have on the outside, right? You had the Western Illinois transfer. You had the Charlotte transfer. You have a Mercer transfer. You have Ja'Kai Moore, who's quite athletic and built for that position, and it seems like has never been able to fully hold it down. You've just, you've got Kason Henry, who is coming into year 3. That's a guy.
He's got a health issue.
Oh,
I failed to mention big.
That's my bad.
Sydney Fugar.
Mm-hmm.
But Shane Beamer was asked about the health of his football team. He said, obviously, and this goes back to, this was a Brad Lawing-ism, or a Law Dog-ism, is when you have guys like Jordan Strawn and Mo Kaba who are proven talents but who have also had injuries, it's your job to get them to the first game of the season healthy, not for them to be full go in every practice and to start every scrimmage and play 70 out of the 100 plays you may run in a scrimmage, right? So, I mean, it will be interesting with those guys on the offensive line, because how healthy is Kason Henry? Where, Shane Beamer said yesterday on JC and Morgan that he had been in a meeting with Lonnie Teasley and Greg Adkins saying, okay, where are we here? He talked about cross training, guys playing multiple positions to try to figure out who the best 5 are, where they fit. The transfers, the young guys, where are they now? Where do we think they'll be 4 weeks from now? And where will they be a month into the season? That kind of thing. And so, I mean, they do have a lot of guys, because to me, Jackson Hughes is very intriguing at 6'6", almost 300 pounds, who, other than Ja'Kai Moore, has started the most games of anybody on the roster as a left tackle, right? Mm-hmm. And then you do have big Sidney Fugar, and you do have Tyshawn Wanamaker, who I think has been highly underestimated because he used to weigh 335 pounds and everybody thought he was a guard. But one of my best friends who in high school coaching, who happens to coach a very elite class of 24 offensive tackle, told me when he went to the Shrine Bowl that year that Tyshawn Wanamaker, his feet were unbelievable, and he thought he would definitely be a tackle in college. And so they've got guys. To me, the middle of the line is also important, because that's where you can't really have the pocket break down, because that makes it impossible for the quarterback to then step up into the pocket, which Spencer Rattler got more confident towards the end of the season in stepping up in the pocket. But you can't do that if the middle of the pocket with those three interior guys breaks down.
I should also say, I had meant to mention this earlier. I don't, we don't 100% know how, the Dowell Loggains offense is going to look. But I will say this, in some cases, that Bear Raid has been able to sort of de-emphasize the pass blocking ability of those guys, because you can generate good rushing offense, and because good rushing offense can hold up defensive ends, can give your linemen a little bit more of an edge, can move the pocket and kind of shift that. It can de-emphasize your tackles a little bit if you have the right kind of passing offense. And I'll be interested to see if South Carolina ends up being able to do that kind of thing, take the pressure off those guys. I think that could potentially be something just to keep an eye out for. But yeah, I think it's a little like that running back room. You got a lot of people with potential that are intriguing, that are interesting. And the question is, it's a little easier, I think, than a running back room in some cases, because you have to get to a point where you come out and you say, we have 2 guys we feel comfortable. You want to have more guys, but you can live a season, assuming no one's knee gets rolled up on, tough assumption, with 2 good guys. And, in the past, we've seen Ja'Kai Moore struggle to be that all the time. Tyshawn Wanamaker hasn't necessarily been, an A, but he's often been, a very consistent C+, B-. And consistency counts for a lot, because if you're an A on 1 play and an F for 2 more plays, well, then your quarterback's killed and you got tackled for a loss of 6 yards. So just being able to be that consistent matters. And I'm just interested to see how it works out. I'm interested to see what we hear. I'm interested to see what coaches are willing to say through camp. And then I'm interested to see, once games actually start, those early snaps. I'll go back to a former Gamecock for a moment, Justin Turntine. Justin Turntine was a guy who could have some good reps, also had a lot of very bad reps. He went to Florida State, change of scenery. I wonder if there was a little bit of a reset when things went as badly as they did at South Carolina. As far as I could tell, when he was healthy at Florida State, he was a very consistent B-. And sometimes as an offensive tackle, that is all you need.
So just a couple more, one on the offensive line, and then about always the most popular guy on campus, the backup quarterback. But so I'm interested in your take on a couple of different things about the offensive line and the scheme in general. Under Captain Dumbass, you had virtually, very small line splits. You had a ton of bunch formations. Dowell Loggains talked about forcing the defense to have to defend the entire width and length of the field. One of the things in the air raid, and in particular in the Art Briles, Kendall Briles system, is really spreading defenses out horizontally, having wide receivers out really wide on both sides of the field, bigger line splits as well. And then the simplification of the scheme, which we touched on. I mean, you had a lot of young guys in 2020 that played a lot of football these last 2 years at South Carolina under the former guy. But you had Mike Bobo with a scheme. Hell, he only had one wide receiver, Shi Smith. Everybody knew it. But other than about one game, Shi Smith still caught a bunch of balls every game, and everybody knew South Carolina had to run it, and Kevin Harris still led the SEC in rushing. And I think it's the simplification of the scheme so guys don't have to think as much, but they can play free. How do you anticipate the scheme shift on the offensive line and spreading teams out more than bunching up all 11 guys in the box?
Well, I think that's going to be kind of an interesting early tell. Do they come out in those Baylor and Tennessee style super wide splits? Is that something they go to? Do they try to play around with that box math? What does that kind of look like? And especially because a lot of those offenses tend to like having a quarterback run threat, which Spencer Rattler has moments, but he's not really a called run guy. He's a improvisational guy on that front. But yeah, I think it's very much going to be a tell kind of on that front. And in terms of, bunching it up or not, I was less concerned in terms of the passing game last season. It didn't seem like at times they would go from that little tight trips bunch in terms of the run game, but they weren't necessarily like a bunch it up run all that much. I guess a little on short yardage too. All that being said, I'll be interested to see, do they kind of go to that sort of spread stuff? What does that mean in terms of how they use their tight ends? Especially if they play two of them at the same time, because, as you kind of said, there's some receiver ability in there. There's maybe a little tight end ability in there, or I should say a little like pure blocking ability, but maybe a little less than we saw last year when you had a Stogner and a Nate Adkins who were really strong blockers. But yeah, I think that'll be something you'll see quickly, because they'll have to go out there and it'll be a question of is this just your standard, tight end defenders in the box.
All right, so there is a guy down there that has really been the talk ever since he got down there. The great thing is you have Spencer Rattler, you have Luke Doty, you have a guy in Tanner Bailey who had been the number one guy on your board that committed to Oregon and then fell in your lap right before National Signing Day. You have a really talented quarterback room, but Lenore Sellers, 6'3", 245 pounds, legitimate 4.4 speed in the 40, a guy with a cannon for an arm. And I'm curious as to what your sources are saying, but I mean, let's face it, this is definitely Spencer Rattler's last year, and I do think in the 2024 season, there will be a legitimate quarterback battle, and Lenore Sellers may just be too good to keep off the field that they may have some kind of limited package for him, because he is different than Spencer Rattler, and he's, the same size as KJ Jefferson, and he is a very good runner, but at the same time, he had over a 5.0 GPA because of all the AP classes he was taking. He's impressed everybody down there, and the arm talent is evident. He led his team to a state championship and wound up as one of the top 2 or 3 ranked guys in the class by on 3. What are your thoughts about, obviously the comfort of the experience of Luke Doty, who's waited his turn like the good soldier, right? And has been a team guy, but then you bring in a guy that athletically is just on a different plane than anybody else down there.
I think an element of it's going to be, first, the big question I'm going to have through all of this is Lenore Sellers ready to push college level piles? And by that, I mean, is he a guy who can run through, he's built like a guy who can run through someone. But sometimes it takes a little bit to kind of develop that feel and that oomph, coming from high school to college. So if he shows up ready to launch through some linebacker, then you almost have to put him out there, if for no other reason than to try to get your running game a little bit lathered up. If he can be that plus runner, that's kind of a game changer. If he's not, if he doesn't quite show that pop, I would kind of imagine. I imagine Luke Doty is going to go in probably the number 2 regardless, just for the sake of what I would kind of call, for the sake of harmony. I think Luke Doty is the kind of kid who's going to be a Gamecock as long as he can be. But for the sake of harmony, it's hard to unring the bell of putting a third-year guy, putting a first-year guy ahead of a fourth-year guy. So I'd imagine, at least on the depth chart, what it'll say is that. Now, the question is going to be, how can you use Sellers? And another question might be like, is there a way to use Luke Doty in some way? Is there, Luke Doty, not a shabby athlete by any stretch. What does he show in terms of pop, in terms of beyond, I guess, what I would call the Michael Scarnecchia-ism of, Michael Scarnecchia, probably not, probably didn't have the physical talent to be a star, but he always knew what he was doing. And Doty strikes me as that kind of kid who's going to know what he should be doing. That's something coaches like in a backup. But in terms of Sellers, again, is he ready to push piles? Because if you're putting him in there just to pass, you already have Spencer Rattler. But if he's ready to push piles, if he's a guy that you can put a couple of H-backs in front of on 3rd and 2 and feel pretty good about getting it, and then maybe, run a few pop passes off of that, that's kind of going to be where your money is, in my opinion. If he is a guy who can excel in that secondary role, and especially because you don't have DeCarrion Joyner anymore, and that power read stuff that they ran with him is still good, is still nice offense, and if you still have the pieces to do that, and he can be a guy who can, plug it up in the hole a little bit, then that's going to be the thing that gets him on the field. If you can run power read, a defensive end jumps out, and he can follow his guard and bounce off a linebacker, or at least make the linebacker hurt a little bit, that's what's going to get him to be sort of a guy who has a role this season.
All right, well, Ben, man, great stuff. I can't thank you enough for joining us. I hope we can circle back around and do this and talk about the defense.
Absolutely.
Because I think our listeners have learned a lot. I've learned a lot listening to you today, and it's been a lot of fun and a lot of great conversation. And so be well, my friend, and let's circle back and break down the defense like we did the offense today.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me on.
All right. That is Ben Breiner, formerly of Go Gamecocks in the state, now breaking it all down at thebigspur.com. I'll be right back after this commercial message.
If you enjoy listening and watching the Free Wednesday show, now live streaming on YouTube, and would love more Gamecock Pod daily, join our growing Gamecock family by becoming a monthly or annual subscriber. You'll be able to listen to the show every day of the week and listen to guests like J.C. Sherbert, Hale McGranahan, and John Whittle from thebigspur.com, Colin Taylor and Mike Yuva from Gamecock Central, Emily Adams from the Greenville News, Ben Portnoy, Michael Lanana, and Jeremiah Holloway from GoGamecocks.com, Michael W. Bratton, the host of That SEC podcast, and many, many more. As a VIP subscriber, you can join or listen to the weekly live Zoom call with up to 100 of your favorite Gamecocks and friends. After the show is an unrecorded overtime segment where the real scoop gets dropped and discussed. It's like going down to your local pub or sports bar and having a conversation with your Gamecock friends about last week's football game, men's and women's basketball games, and Gamecock baseball. And of course, there's always recruiting to discuss. In addition to the weekly Zoom call, VIP subscribers get the most popular podcast, The Morning After, which is released every Sunday morning during football season, and more VIP perks are in the works. Follow Keith on Twitter at KAllset, or follow the show on Twitter at GamecockPod. Go to the top of the homepage and follow the link. If all else fails, go to patreon.com/GamecockPodDaily. Join now and get up to 3 months free off an annual VIP subscription. You will love it, guaranteed. Now, back to Gamecock Pod Live.
All right, I'm back. What a great job by Ben Breiner today. Can't thank him enough. Also want to say today's show is brought to you by 5diamondbotanicals.com, mind, body, and spirit, hemp-derived CBD edibles, oils, and topicals. And these products have made a huge difference for me and a number of our patrons. I've gotten a lot of positive testimonials. Some of the benefits that I have received and others have received, including giving you a sense of calm for focus, supporting the management of everyday stress and strain, which we have on our jobs, at home, wherever. Definitely helps speed up and helps with the recovery from exercise-induced inflammation, and helps support healthy sleep cycles and supports pain relief. They've got a full line of products. They've got products for the ladies of your house with soaps, bath bombs, body lotions. For me, I love the Nano CBD products. The sublingual drops help me fall asleep at night. They do have the gummies, which are really cool as well. But the Nano roll-on, I really use during baseball and football season with my knees. My IT bands and hip flexors are really tight. And the Nano salve has really become my go-to after I shower, after a day out on the diamond in 116 degree heat index. When you're, squatting down behind the plate for, maybe if you're doing 3 or 4 games and you're behind the plate twice, maybe 400 times, if each team has 100 pitches. And I have a bad groin that I ripped back in 2006 that's really tight. And so I put that CBD salve on there and on my knees, and it really, really helps while your pores are open after you've come out of the bath or shower. 5 Diamond Botanicals was founded by a good friend of mine, Lisa Williams, in Atlanta, Georgia, a healthcare professional with over 26 years of experience, and founded on the principles of honesty and transparency. Plus, all of these products are derived from hemp that is 100% organically grown and produced here in the good old US of A. So go to 5diamondbotanicals.com. You can see it scrolling on the bottom of the page. 5 is spelled F-I-V-E, diamondbotanicals.com. Proud sponsor of Gamecock Pod Daily and Gamecock Pod Live. So I had a question about what will the wide receiver core look like next year. Well, it's obviously going to look a lot different than this year. Juice Wells is going to be gone. Eddie Lewis is going to be gone. Amarian Brown is going to be gone. I do think Xavier Legette could have one more year, but if he has a big year, he will be gone. And so, obviously, without knowing who South Carolina is going to target in the transfer portal, which I imagine they will be aggressive there, I think you're looking at a guy like Kalik Horton, who's a big, fast, raw, athletic guy, probably just needs 1 year, needs one more year to be a major producer. You hope Landon Sampson develops. I have not heard really a whole lot about him since bowl practice. There were no positive reports during the spring, but a guy that is quick, fast, athletic, played at a big-time high school program, and a guy that TCU made a late run at, you'd like to hope he really progresses. All right, South Carolina is bringing in 5 wide receivers. They're on campus right now, okay? And so they feel like they've hit on every one of those guys. Everybody talks about Nicholas Harbor. I think next year he will be fully ready to be elite out there. I hope Joshua Simon will come back for another year, but he may be too good. He may be in the NFL. He's a guy that can play wide receiver and tight end, but I know they love Elijah Caldwell. I expect him to play. I know they love CJ Adams. Kelton Henderson is a quick twitch, fast, elite guy who was an Under Armour All-American, and then Tyshawn Russell led his team to a state championship at Bishop McDevitt up in Pennsylvania in a big-time high school football league, and he caught 4 touchdown passes. He had primarily been a defensive back. He was featured at wide receiver as a senior. Pete Limbo recruited him. Justin Stepp loved him. I've heard great things about all of those guys. Now, they're not all going to have to play this year unless there's just a run of injuries. But those are the names of the guys on campus at wide receiver, not counting the tight ends like Connor Cox and Reed McKeska. Reed McKeska, I love. I hear a lot of good things. I hear a lot of good things about Connor Cox. And Michael Smith is an absolute freak. And if he comes in mid-year next year, he's going to be on the field somewhere. That guy is good enough to play for any team in the country. A big kid, fast, strong, really kind of like Trey Knox and Joshua Simon, a bigger guy that's like a wide receiver that'll be a flex tight end. And so I do think the Gamecocks have a lot of impressive young guys. I think Kalik Horton probably needs one more year. Maybe you get another year from Xavier Legette because he loves being a Gamecock. But it will look different, and I would expect South Carolina to be active in the transfer portal in December to try to add a couple of veteran difference makers there. I also really like Zamarian Lang on film. Jonathan Paylor is a guy that if you get him, I think he's a difference maker at the slot. I think he's a guy that could really upgrade your wide receiver position. I don't count South Carolina out on Keelan Adams. If you looked at his announcement video, it looked like somebody had just stolen his ice cream. That was clearly NIL driven, and it was a family member influencing him. He had been committed since the Monday, so I guess June 9th was a Friday, so 10, would it be June 12th? There was 3 welcome homes that day. He was one of them. The first high school guy to commit to Shane Beamer, and he sent a welcome home out that did not follow through on his announcement. So they are bringing in a lot of young, talented guys. Certainly Mazio Bennett's already on board, and we'll see who else they add. I do really like Zamarian Lang. He kind of reminds me of Xavier Leggett, but more polished and catches the ball more naturally because he has played more wide receiver. And you never know. I mean, Vakari Swain, man, I still love that dude as a wide receiver. We'll see what happens with the, defensive backboard. I think you need to get that guy on the field wherever he can help you the most. And so that, Craig, would be my comment on the wide receiver core for next year. I think it's going to be young but talented. But I also think, South Carolina is going to be a factor because there is playing time to promise to veterans that are looking to make a move. And the better shape the collectives are in December, the more impactful South Carolina can be in that transfer portal window. All right, so that's going to do it for today. I will be back tonight. All patrons can join us on the Garnet and Black Town Hall. Some announcements on changes and a new feature that we'll be adding soon. And so special thanks to Ben Breiner. Special thanks to all of you. And so until tonight, God bless America, go Gamecocks, and God protect our troops. I'm out of here.